in September of 1852, the wife of Virginia's wealthiest plantation owner. Margaret Whitmore experienced her first orgasm at 28 years old after 6 years of marriage. But at that exact moment, she was watching a woman's throat being cut right before her eyes. And the man doing it was her husband's most valuable slave, a psychopathic killer, a man who had already killed 9 people with his bare hands by that point. That night, a door opened in Margaret's soul, and when she discovered what lay beyond that door, there was no turning back. But the real question is, what was this thing that began between Margaret and that slave? And why did their relationship become more passionate each time a woman died? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Virginia's Tidewater region in 1852 was a world built on contradictions that nobody dared to acknowledge. Grand mansions rose above fields worked by human beings treated as property. Churches preached salvation while their congregations owned souls. And in the homes of the wealthy, where crystal chandeliers cast perfect light on polished mahogany, darkness lived in forms that respectable society refused to see. Whitmore Plantation stretched across 12,200 acres of prime tobaccoland along the James River. Its white column manor house stood as a monument to prosperity extracted from the labor of 87 enslaved people. Thomas Whitmore, at 34 years old, represented everything that Southern aristocracy claimed to value. He was educated at the College of William and Mary, well-traveled and known throughout Virginia society as a gentleman of impeccable manners and refined taste. He quoted Shakespeare at dinner parties, collected rare books, and treated his slaves with what he called enlightened management, meaning he rarely used the whip himself, preferring to delegate such unpleasantness to his overseers. Thomas had married Margaret Preston in 1846 when she was just 22 years old. Margaret came from a respected Charleston family that had fallen on difficult financial times. The marriage was practical on both sides. Thomas needed a wife who could manage his household and provide heirs. Margaret needed security and status that her own family could no longer guarantee. She was beautiful in the way that Southern society valued. Delicate features, pale skin that never saw direct sunlight, dark hair always perfectly arranged, and a figure maintained through restrictive corseting and carefully controlled portions. But beauty and breeding had not translated into marital happiness. 6 years into their marriage, Margaret existed in a state of profound disconnection from her own life. She performed her duties flawlessly. She managed the household slaves with efficiency, entertained Thomas's business associates with grace, and maintained the social obligations expected of a plantation mistress. But inside she felt nothing. The numbness had started gradually, so slowly that she did not notice it consuming her, until one day she realized that nothing brought her joy. Not music, not reading, not the gardens she had once loved tending, not the social gatherings where she was admired and envied. She moved through her days like an actress performing a role in a play that never ended. Her relationship with Thomas was courteous and distant. He was never cruel to her. In fact, he was consistently kind in the detached way of a man who had fulfilled his obligations by providing a comfortable home and asking very little in return. Their physical relationship was infrequent and entirely unsatisfying. Thomas approached intimacy with the same methodical consideration he brought to every aspect of his life. He was gentle, patient, and utterly incapable of stirring any passion in his wife. Margaret had never experienced orgasm. She was not entirely certain such a thing was real for women, or if it was simply another myth that novels suggested. But reality never delivered. The household's psychological dynamics were further complicated by the presence of Samuel, Thomas's most valuable property and most dangerous possession. Samuel was 31 years old, standing 6'4" tall and weighing approximately 240 pounds of dense muscle, built through years of brutal labor and natural physical dominance. He had been purchased at auction in 1843, originally intended for field work, but Thomas had quickly recognized that Samuel possessed unusual qualities that made him far more valuable than a typical field hand. Samuel was exceptionally intelligent, learning tasks after a single demonstration and understanding complex instructions that would confuse other workers. He was also terrifyingly strong and completely devoid of normal human empathy. Samuel had killed his first person at age 19, another slave who had challenged him over food. He had beaten the man to death with such savage efficiency that the plantation owner, rather than punishing him, had recognized Samuel's potential as an enforcer. Over the following years, Samuel had killed 8 more people, sometimes at his owner's direction, when discipline examples needed to be set, sometimes of his own initiative, when he perceived challenges to his position. But what made Samuel truly terrifying was not just his capacity for violence, but his intelligence about it. He understood instinctively how to make deaths look like accidents or natural causes. In 1845, a man who had stolen food from the overseer's storehouse was found drowned in an irrigation ditch. Everyone knew Samuel had done it, but the body showed no signs of struggle, no marks of violence. Just a man who had apparently slipped and hit his head. In 1847, a woman who had threatened to report Samuel to authorities simply disappeared one night. Her cabin showed signs of hasty departure. Her few possessions were gone, and 6 months later, hunters found bones in the woods 3 miles from the plantation, picked clean by animals impossible to identify with certainty. Samuel kept a mental catalog of every person he killed. Names, dates, methods, locations of bodies. It was a private accounting that he never spoke of, but never forgot. This was not mindless brutality. This was methodical, calculated murder conducted by someone who understood exactly what he was and felt no remorse about it. Thomas had purchased Samuel in 1843, knowing his history, seeing him not as a monster, but as a tool, a controllable weapon that could maintain order among the other enslaved people through fear and occasional demonstration of overwhelming violence. But Samuel was not entirely controllable, and Thomas knew it. He managed Samuel through a combination of privileges, careful handling, and the understanding that Samuel's usefulness outweighed his danger as long as he directed his violence according to Thomas's interests. Samuel lived in a separate cabin rather than the slave quarters. He received better food, occasionally alcohol, and most significantly, Thomas looked the other way when women disappeared from the quarters. The official explanation was always runaways. The unofficial reality known, but never spoken, was that Samuel took women when he wanted them, and what happened to them afterward was something people preferred not to investigate too carefully. By September 1852, at least 3 women had vanished after being seen going to Samuel's cabin. Their disappearances created ripples of fear through the slave community, but Thomas dismissed concerns when they were tentatively raised by his head overseer. Samuel's productivity and his ability to intimidate the other slaves into maximum efficiency made him too valuable to discipline over what Thomas considered minor incidents. Besides, Thomas reasoned runaways were a common problem, and he had no concrete proof that Samuel was responsible for anything criminal beyond the documented incidents he had already overlooked. Margaret knew about Samuel the way she knew about everything on the plantation that happened beyond the elegant rooms where she spent her days. She had seen him from windows, a massive figure moving through the grounds, with the relaxed confidence of a predator in familiar territory. She had heard whispered conversations between house slaves abruptly ending when she entered rooms. She had noticed the way other enslaved people gave Samuel wide space, never making eye contact, never speaking to him unless absolutely necessary. And she had sensed, in the way Thomas occasionally mentioned Samuel with a tone that mixed satisfaction and unease, that this slave was somehow different from all the others. But until the night of September 17th, 1852, Margaret had never been close enough to Samuel to truly see him. She had never looked into his eyes. She had never witnessed what he was capable of doing. And she had certainly never imagined that he would come the catalyst for unlocking something in her that she did not know existed. That evening began, like countless others. Thomas had retired early, complaining of a headache after a long day spent reviewing account books with his business manager. Margaret had gone through her nightly routine with mechanical precision. Her lady's maid helped her undress, removed the painful corset that had restricted her breathing all day, brushed out her long dark hair, and helped her into a modest white nightgown. After dismissing the maid, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing that sleep would not come easily. Insomnia had plagued her for months. She would lie awake for hours, her mind simultaneously racing with anxious thoughts and feeling completely empty. On this particular night, after 2 hours of restless tossing, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would go outside just for a few minutes, just to feel something different than the suffocating sameness of her bedroom. She put on a robe over her nightgown and slippers on her feet, then quietly made her way through the dark house and out a side door that led to the gardens. The September night was warm and humid, the air heavy with the scent of late-blooming jasmine, and the earthy smell of the tobacco fields beyond the cultivated grounds. A bright moon illuminated the formal gardens in silver light, casting deep shadows beneath the magnolia trees that bordered the property. Margaret walked slowly along the gravel paths, breathing deeply, trying to feel something, anything, beyond the numbness that had become her constant state. She was not afraid. The plantation seemed entirely still, the slave quarters dark and silent in the distance. The main house, a white monument rising behind her. She had walked perhaps 100 yards from the house when she heard sounds coming from behind a dense screen of onder bushes near the property's eastern boundary. Low voices, a woman's laugh, then other sounds that made Margaret freeze in place, her heart suddenly pounding. She knew she should turn back, return to the house, pretend she had heard nothing, but something stronger than propriety or fear pulled her forward. Moving as quietly as possible, Margaret approached the oleander bushes and carefully parted the dense foliage just enough to see through. What she witnessed in the moonlit clearing beyond made her breath stop in her throat. Samuel was there. She recognized him immediately. Though she had never been this close before, he was shirtless, his massive frame gleaming with sweat in the moonlight, every muscle visible and defined like something carved from dark stone. Scars crossed his back and shoulders, testament to years of brutal treatment. And he was with a woman, a young slave woman that Margaret recognized as Clara, a field probably no more than 20 years old. Clara had arrived at the plantation just 8 months earlier, purchased at auction in Richmond. She had a bright smile that Margaret had noticed from afar, a spirit that had not yet been broken by the brutal reality of plantation life. What they were doing bore no resemblance to the careful, controlled intimacy that Margaret knew from her marital bed. This was raw, primal, almost violent in its intensity. Clara was pressed against an ancient oak tree, its rough bark scraping her exposed skin. Her simple cotton dress had been torn open, hanging in tatters around her waist. Her head was thrown back, exposing the long line of her throat. Samuel held her there with one massive hand wrapped completely around her neck, his fingers meeting his thumb on the other side. Not choking her yet, but the threat was implicit in his grip, controlling her completely. His other hand gripped her hip with such force that Margaret could see his fingers pressing deep into her flesh, even from 15 feet away, leaving marks that would become dark bruises if Clara lived long enough for them to develop. The sounds Clara was making were unlike anything Margaret had ever heard. Gasping, moaning, almost crying, but not entirely in pain. At least not only in pain. There was something else in those sounds. Pleasure mixed with fear. Arousal intertwined with the certain knowledge that this encounter would not end well for her and Samuel's face, visible in profile as the moonlight caught it, wore an expression of focused intensity that was somehow more disturbing than if he had shown obvious pleasure. He looked like a man performing a task that required his complete attention and considerable skill. Skill, like a craftsman at work. His eyes were half closed, his jaw set, and Margaret could see a vein pulsing in his temple with each movement. Margaret knew she should look away, knew she should leave immediately. This was a violation of every social rule that governed her world. A white woman of her position should never witness such things, should never acknowledge that such acts occurred, should certainly never remain, watching with growing fascination. But she could not move. Something about what she was witnessing held her frozen in place. Her heart was racing so fast she could feel it in her throat. Her breathing had become shallow and quick, coming in small gasps that matched Clara's rhythm, and she felt a warmth spreading through her body that she had never experienced before, starting low in her belly and radiating outward in waves. Her hand, moving almost of its own accord, slipped beneath her robe and nightgown, finding the place between her legs that she rarely touched, and never with any pleasure. Thomas had told her once years ago that respectable women did not experience such urges, that physical pleasure was something men needed, and women endured. She had believed him. But now, watching Samuel and Clara through the screen of leaves, Margaret's fingers moved in rhythm with what she was seeing, and her body responded in ways it never had before. The numbness that had defined her existence was cracking open, replaced by sensations so intense it was almost painful. In the clearing, Samuel's movements became more aggressive, more urgent. His hand tightened incrementally around Clara's throat, restricting her breathing just enough to intensify every sensation. Clara's sounds grew louder, more desperate, building towards something. And then Samuel's hand tightened around her throat in a way that made Clara's eyes go wide with the sudden understanding of what was about to happen. Margaret watched, her own hand still moving between her legs with increasing urgency as Samuel reached down with his free hand and pulled a knife from his belt. It was a simple tool, probably used for cutting tobacco, about 6 in of blade that caught the moonlight and reflected it back like liquid silver. Samuel held it up where Clara could see it, letting her understand fully what was coming. And something happened in that moment that Margaret would replay in her mind countless times afterward. Clara did not struggle, did not try to escape. Instead, her body seemed to surrender completely, and her sounds changed from fear to something that might have been acceptance or even relief. What happened next occurred in slow motion in Margaret's perception. Though it probably lasted only seconds, Samuel drew the blade across Clara's throat in one smooth motion, starting just below her left ear and pulling the knife all the way across to the right side. The cut was deep and precise, severing everything important in a single stroke. Blood erupted from the wound immediately, spraying in an arc that caught the moonlight and made the droplets look like diamonds suspended in air for just an instant before they fell. The blood painted Samuel's chest and face, ran down Clara's body in rivers that looked black rather than red in the moonlight, soaked into the ground beneath their feet. Clara's mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but produced only a wet, bubbling sound as air escaped through the opening in her throat. Her hands came up instinctively to the wound, fingers trying uselessly to hold the severed edges together, as if she could somehow reverse what had been done. Her body convulsed in ways that looked sickeningly similar to passion, her back arching, her legs tightening around Samuel's hips, her entire frame shuddering. And Samuel, still gripping her, still moving inside her, threw his head back and released a low sound that was part growl, part groan, as Clara's life drained away beneath his hands. He climaxed as she died. The two events synchronized perfectly, and Margaret understood with sudden clarity that this timing was not accidental. Samuel had done this before many times. He knew exactly how long it took, knew precisely when to make the cut to create this specific experience. Margaret's entire body exploded in sensation she had never imagined possible. The orgasm tore through her with such force that her knees buckled, and she had to grab onto the oleander branches to keep from collapsing, the leaves cutting into her palms, but the pain barely registering. Wave after wave of pleasure crashed through her, more intense than anything she had ever read about in the forbidden novels she sometimes found in Thomas's library, more powerful than she had dreamed possible, her hands still pressed between her legs. Working frantically, her hips moving against her own touch, her eyes remained locked on the horrific scene before her, unable to look away. Even as Clara's life visibly left her body, she was dimly aware that she was making small sounds in her throat, gasping for breath, her entire body shaking with the force of sensations that seemed to go on forever, building and cresting and building again. When the waves finally subsided, leaving her trembling and weak, her legs barely able to support her weight, Margaret's mind caught up with what her body had just experienced. Horror crashed over her like cold water, but it was a strange kind of horror, not at what Samuel had done. Though that should have been horrifying enough. A woman had just died, been murdered, had her throat cut while being raped. This was evil in its purest form. But Margaret's horror was directed inward, at her own response to it, at the undeniable fact that watching a woman die had given her the first real pleasure she had ever known. At the wetness on her fingers, the trembling in her thighs, the racing of her heart that was only now beginning to slow. What did it mean that she had climaxed while witnessing murder? What kind of person experienced sexual release while watching another human being's life end? Margaret had been raised to believe in her own moral superiority, in the inherent goodness of people like her, who attended church every Sunday and performed charitable works. But in that moment, she understood that something dark had always lived inside her, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Or perhaps Samuel had somehow infected her with his sickness, transferred it through the simple act of being witnessed. She stumbled backward, her hand over her mouth to muffle any sound, her legs barely supporting her weight. In the clearing, Samuel was lowering Clarara's body to the ground with almost clinical detachment. Already producing a cloth to clean himself, he worked methodically, efficiently. Like a man who had done this many times before, Margaret fled back to the house, moving as quietly as her shaking legs would allow. She made it to her bedroom without encountering anyone, closed the door, and collapsed onto her bed. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat. Her body still trembled with aftershocks of sensation, and her mind reeled with the implications of what had just happened. She had just witnessed murder. She should report it. Tell Thomas. Alert the authorities. Clarara's body was out there somewhere, evidence of a terrible crime. But even as these thoughts formed, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she would say nothing, because to report what she had seen would require explaining why she had been there, what she had watched, how her body had responded. And more disturbing than any of that was the dark knowledge now awakening in her mind. The knowledge that she wanted to feel that way again, that the numbness that had defined her existence for so long had been shattered, replaced by sensations so powerful it made everything else in her life seem like a pale shadow. And somehow impossibly that sensation was connected to what Samuel had done. Margaret lay in her bed as dawn began to lighten the sky outside her windows, and she understood with perfect clarity that her life had just divided in before and after. Before that night, she had been a respectable plantation mistress, performing her role with flawless propriety while feeling nothing. After that night, she was something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for, but something that was finally terribly alive. The following morning arrived with the usual routines that structured plantation life. Slaves rose before dawn to begin their assigned tasks. The kitchen staff prepared breakfast for the main house. Thomas emerged from his bedroom fully dressed and in good spirits, his headache apparently cured by a night of sound sleep. And Margaret came down to breakfast looking exactly as she always did. Her hair perfectly arranged, her dress impeccable, her expression composed and serene. But inside she was screaming. If you are finding this dark tale as disturbing as it is fascinating, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Our community of truth seekers grows stronger with each new member, and your support allows us to continue uncovering these hidden chapters of American history. What other dark secrets might be buried in the past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Throughout that day, Margaret moved through her duties with mechanical precision, while her mind raced. She kept expecting someone to discover Clarara's body, kept waiting for an alarm to be raised, for Thomas to be summoned, for the terrible truth to emerge into daylight. But nothing happened. Breakfast proceeded normally, with Thomas reading his newspaper and commenting on tobacco prices, while Margaret poured tea with steady hands, showed no sign of what those hands had done just hours earlier. The household slaves moved through their tasks with their usual efficiency. The morning progressed into afternoon without incident. Dinner came and went with the usual polite conversation. Thomas discussed a letter he had received from a business associate in Charleston. He asked Margaret about her plans to host a garden party the following month. She responded appropriately, suggesting menu items and guests, her voice calm and pleasant. To anyone observing, they were simply a respectable plantation couple conducting their daily routines. No one could have guessed that Margaret was replaying the previous night's events in her mind with such vivid intensity that she could barely concentrate on the conversation. Evening arrived without incident, and Margaret began to understand that Samuel must have disposed of the body in a way that would prevent its discovery, at least not immediately. She found herself wondering where he had put Clara, how he had managed to move a body without being seen, what he had done to prevent the smell of decomposition from revealing the burial site. These were not thoughts a respectable woman should have. But Margaret discovered that she wanted to know, needed to know, because understanding Samuel's methods meant understanding the possibility of what might happen next. She also began to realize that this was not the first time. The efficient way Samuel had worked after the killing, the practiced method of his cleanup, the complete absence of panic or uncertainty. This was routine for him, a process he had refined over multiple iterations. And somehow, impossibly, he had been getting away with it, which meant the three women who had officially disappeared as runaways had probably met the same fate as Clara, which meant that Samuel had killed at least 4 women on this plantation alone, and probably more at his previous locations, which meant that Margaret had witnessed not an isolated incident of passion gone wrong, but a glimpse into the pattern of a serial killer who had been operating with impunity for years. And the most disturbing realization of all was that this knowledge made Margaret more aroused, not less. That night, alone in her bedroom after Thomas had retired to his own quarters, she touched herself again while replaying the memory of Clara's death, and once again, her body responded with intensity that shocked her. This was not a single aberration. This was who she was, who she had perhaps always been, waiting only for the right catalyst to unlock this terrible truth. 3 days after that night in the garden, Clara was officially listed as a runaway. Thomas discussed it briefly at dinner, expressing mild annoyance at the loss of a fieldand, but no real concern. Margaret said nothing, her face betraying none of the knowledge burning inside her. But Samuel knew. Margaret first became certain of this on the 5th day after Clara's death. She was walking through the back gardens in late afternoon when she encountered Samuel carrying tools from the main barn toward the equipment shed. It was the first time since that night that they had been close enough to acknowledge each other's presence. As they passed, Samuel's eyes met hers for just a moment. And in that brief connection, Margaret saw knowledge, recognition, and something that might have been amusement. He knew she had been there, had known it that very night, probably heard her flee through the bushes, certainly understood that she had witnessed everything, and he was choosing to say nothing. But his silence was not passive. It was a communication in itself, an acknowledgement that they now shared a secret that bound them together in ways that had nothing to do with the social structures that were supposed to govern every interaction on the plantation. Margaret felt heat rise through her body at that look. The same warmth that had begun in the garden, the same sensation that had led to her first orgasm while watching death. And she saw in the slight curve of Samuel's lips before he moved past her that he recognized this response too. Over the following weeks, Margaret became obsessed not with Samuel himself, though his physical presence had taken on new meaning for her, but with the sensation she had experienced that night, with the possibility that such intensity could exist in a life that had been defined by numbness. She began taking walks at night, always careful to appear merely restless if anyone encountered her, always with plausible reasons for being outside the house after dark. She never again witnessed what she had seen that first night, but she saw Samuel frequently, always at a distance, always in circumstances that prevented conversation. And each time their eyes met, that same understanding passed between them. They were aware of each other in a way that charged the air around them. Thomas noticed nothing. His days were consumed with plantation business, his evenings with his books and his brandy. His relationship with Margaret continued exactly as it had before, distant and polite, with very occasional conjugal visits that left her as unsatisfied as ever. But now Margaret understood what satisfaction could feel like, and the absence of it became torture rather than mere numbness. 6 weeks after Clara's death, another woman disappeared from the plantation. This one was named Rose, a house slave who worked in the laundry. The circumstances were different enough that no one explicitly connected the two disappearances. Rose had mentioned wanting to escape to relatives in Richmond. Her vanishing was treated as unfortunate, but understandable. And once again, no body was discovered, but Margaret knew. She knew with absolute certainty what had happened to Rose, even though she had not witnessed it. And then the knowledge made her body respond exactly as it had in the garden. She lay in her bed that night, her hand between her legs, imagining what Samuel had done, how Rose must have died, and her body trembled with release. This pattern could not continue indefinitely. Margaret understood that she was becoming someone unrecognizable, that what she was feeling and fantasizing about placed outside the boundaries of anything that could be called normal or moral. But she also understood that she could not go back to the numbness, could not return to existing as a beautiful, empty vessel performing a role in someone else's story. She needed to cross the line completely, needed to move from witness and imaginer to participant. And somehow Samuel needed to understand this without her having to speak it directly, because the words themselves were impossible to form. The opportunity came in mid-November on a cold night when Thomas had traveled to Richmond on business and would not return until the following afternoon. Margaret informed the household staff that she would retire early with a headache and should not be disturbed. Then she waited in her bedroom until the house fell completely silent. Just after midnight, Margaret left through the same side door she had used that first night. But this time she did not wander the gardens. This time she walked directly towards Samuel's cabin, a structure separated from the main slave quarters built near the equipment barns. A single window showed lamplight within, confirming his presence. Margaret stood outside that door for a long moment, her heart pounding, and knowing that once she knocked, there would be no possibility of pretending this was an accident or misunderstanding. This was a choice, a deliberate step into territory that would transform her completely. She knocked, 3 soft taps that seemed impossibly loud in the night's silence. The door opened almost immediately. Samuel stood there filling the doorframe, his face showing no surprise at finding the plantation mistress at his door after midnight. He stepped back wordlessly, and Margaret entered his cabin. The interior was sparse, but surprisingly clean. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a few personal items carefully arranged. A lamp burning on the table cast warm light that created deep shadows in the corners. Samuel closed the door behind her and turned to face her. Waiting, Margaret found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I saw you that night in the garden." "I know." Samuel replied, his voice deep and surprisingly refined. He was more educated than most enslaved people, having been taught to read by a previous owner who valued intelligent property. And the others, Rose, the ones before Clara. Margaret's words were not questions. Yes. The simple admission hung in the air between them. No justifications. No denials. Just acknowledgement of facts that Margaret had already known. "Why?" she asked, though she was not entirely certain what she was asking. Why did he kill them? Why had Thomas never stopped him? Why had he looked at her with that knowing expression? Samuel moved closer, and Margaret's body responded immediately, that same heat spreading through her, but he did not touch her. Instead, he spoke with careful precision, as if explaining something complex to someone who needed to understand fully. "Your husband knows what I am, has always known. He uses what I am because it serves him. Fear keeps the others productive. Fear keeps them from running or rebelling. And I provide that fear." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "But what I do beyond that? The women, that is mine. A payment he pretends not to know about in exchange for what I give him." "And now?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What happens now that I know?" Samuel smiled then, an expression that held no warmth, but considerable intelligence. "Now you have a choice. You can tell your husband what you saw, report me to authorities, or he left the alternative unspoken, but it hung in the air between them with perfect clarity. Margaret took a step closer. "I do not want to report you. I know that, too. I saw your face that night in the garden. Saw what it did to you watching." Another step, closing the distance between them, until they were inches apart. "But you need to understand what you are asking for, what you will become if you cross this line. There is no going back from it." "I know." Margaret whispered, and she did know with perfect clarity. She was about to transform herself into something monstrous, into someone who found sexual pleasure in violence and death, into a participant in murder rather than merely a witness. But the alternative was returning to the numbness, to the empty performance of a life that felt like death anyway. And she could not do that, wouldn't do that. Samuel reached out and placed his massive hand around her throat. Not squeezing, just resting there, his thumb against her pulse. "If we do this, you can't ever claim you did not know. Can't pretend I forced you or deceived you. You will be choosing it every time. Understand?" Margaret's entire body was trembling now, heat pooling between her legs, her breath coming in quick gasps. "Yes, say it clearly. What you want?" The words came out in a rush, shocking in their explicitness, coming from a woman who had been raised to never acknowledge such things existed. "I want to feel what I felt that night. I want to watch you do what you did. And I want you to touch me while I watch." Samuel's hand tightened slightly around her throat, making her gasp. "That is honest. At least, most people dress up their darkness in prettier words. But you need to know something else. What I do to those women. What gives you pleasure watching? It gives me pleasure, too. Not just the sex, the killing itself, That is who I am. And if you are with me, eventually you will want more than just watching. Then give me more." Margaret said, surprised by her own voice, by how steady it had become now that the words were finally being spoken. What happened next was nothing like Margaret's marital bed. Samuel was not gentle or careful. He used her body with the same controlled violence he had used on Clara, and Margaret's response was immediate and overwhelming. He kept his hand around her throat throughout, restricting her breathing just enough to make every sensation more intense. And when she climaxed, it was even more powerful than that first night in the garden, her entire body convulsing in his grip while he watched her with that same focused intensity. Afterward, lying on Samuel's bed, with her clothing disheveled and her body still trembling, Margaret understood that she had fundamentally altered her existence. She was no longer the person who had knocked on that door. She was someone new, someone darker. And the most disturbing thing was how right it felt. How after years of numbness, she was finally terribly alive. If this disturbing chapter of hidden American history has shocked you, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to never miss our investigations into the darkest corners of the past. Our community grows with each of you brave enough to face these truths. What do you think drove Margaret to this darkness? Share your thoughts below. But that night was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Samuel developed a relationship that existed entirely outside every social structure that was supposed to govern the plantation. They met whenever Thomas was away or occupied, sometimes in Samuel's cabin, sometimes in hidden corners of the plantation grounds, and their encounters quickly evolved beyond simple physical encounters. Samuel understood that Margaret's arousal was connected to violence, to the transgression of watching death, and he was willing to provide that. Not immediately, he explained. That would be too dangerous. Bodies disappearing too quickly would eventually draw investigation that even Thomas's willful blindness could not ignore. But he had plans, and now Margaret would be part of them. The psychological dynamic between them was complex and disturbing. Samuel was technically Margaret's property, an enslaved man who legally had no rights or autonomy. But in their private relationship, he held absolute power. Margaret had given it to him willingly, understanding that what she wanted required submission to someone who'd provide experiences she craved. She called him by his name, never used commands, and understood that he could destroy her life completely by revealing their relationship, while she had limited power to truly harm him in return. Yet Samuel also understood his position's precariousness. He was valuable to Thomas only as long as his violence served the plantation's interests, without becoming too obvious. If Margaret ever decided to report what she knew, or if Thomas discovered the full extent of Samuel's activities, even his usefulness would not save him. So their relationship balanced on mutual assured destruction, each holding information that could annihilate the other, bound together by shared transgression. In early December, Samuel told Margaret there would be a woman coming to his cabin in 3 nights, a new field hand, young and healthy. Recently purchased at auction, she has been spreading lies, Samuel explained, telling the others that I am weak, that she is not afraid of me. Your husband wants her disciplined, has not said how, just wants the problem solved. Margaret understood immediately what this meant. You want me there. I want you to watch like before, but this time closer. No hiding in bushes. His eyes held hers. And afterward you stay. You are part of it, not just witnessing from a distance. Margaret's body responded immediately to these words, heat spreading through her despite the December cold. Yes, the waiting was exquisite torture. Margaret moved through her days in a state of heightened awareness, every sensation amplified, counting down hours until the appointed night. She found herself unable to eat properly, food tasting like ash in her mouth. Sleep became almost impossible, her body thrumming with anticipation that made her feel like she might crawl out of her own skin. She caught herself staring at nothing, lost in fantasies of what was coming, only to be jolted back to reality by Thomas, asking her a question she had not heard. Thomas had business in Richmond again. A convenient coincidence that Samuel had apparently helped arrange through careful manipulation of plantation logistics. On the night itself, Margaret waited until the household was asleep, then made her way through darkness to Samuel's cabin. The December air was cold enough to make her breath visible, and frost crunched beneath her feet. She wore a dark cloak that would hide any stains, and underneath it a simple dress that could be easily removed. She had planned this carefully, thought through every detail, understanding that she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Samuel was waiting, and so was the woman. Her name was Hannah, perhaps 19 years old, with defiant eyes and a posture that radiated barely suppressed anger. She had been at Whitmore Plantation for only 3 weeks, purchased at auction in Richmond, where she had been sold after her previous owner died. Hannah had made the mistake of challenging Samuel publicly, telling other slaves that she was not afraid of him, that he was just a man, despite his reputation. Word had gotten back to Thomas, who had summoned Samuel and given him instructions in the coded language they both understood. The problem needed to be solved permanently. Hannah sat bound to a chair in the center of Samuel's cabin, her wrists tied behind her back, her ankles secured to the chair legs. A cloth had been stuffed in her mouth to muffle any sounds she might make. Her eyes were wide with fear now, all that earlier defiance burned away by the reality of her situation. She had understood, probably within minutes of being brought here, exactly what was going to happen to her. What happened over the following hours was far more brutal than what Margaret had witnessed in the garden with Clara. That had been quick, almost merciful in its efficiency. This was something else entirely. Samuel took his time, using Hannah's body first, but with calculated cruelty designed to break her spirit. Before ending her life, he removed the cloth from her mouth, just long enough to hear her beg, to listen to her promise anything. Everything, if he would just let her go. Then he stuffed it back in and continued, his face showing that same focused concentration Margaret had seen before. Margaret watched from just feet away, seated in Samuel's other chair where he had positioned her deliberately. He wanted her close enough to see every detail, to smell the fierce sweat on Hannah's skin, to hear every muffled sound she made. Margaret's hand worked between her legs, her breathing rapid and desperate, her body responding to the horror before her with the same intensity it had shown in the garden. But Samuel was not finished with his demonstration. He wanted Margaret to understand fully what they would be doing together, what partnership in murder truly meant. He produced tools that he had clearly prepared in advance. A knife sharper than the one he had used on Clara, a length of rope, pliers that made Margaret's stomach clench when she saw them. And over the next 2 hours, he used each of these implements on Hannah while explaining to Margaret in calm, almost pedagogical tones exactly what he was doing and why. Pain, Samuel explained as Hannah writhed in the chair, has to be applied carefully. Too much too fast and they go into shock. shut down, become unresponsive, but the right amount increasing gradually keeps them present, aware, and awareness is what makes this powerful. He demonstrated his point, and Hannah's muffled screams became the soundtrack to Margaret's mounting arousal. When Samuel finally killed Hannah, he did it slowly, his hands around her throat, squeezing with gradually increasing pressure. It took nearly 5 minutes for Hannah to die, her face turning colors, her body convulsing, her eyes bulging as blood vessels burst in the whites. And Samuel timed it perfectly, synchronizing his own rhythm with the dying woman's struggles, so that Margaret reached her climax exactly as Hannah took her last shuddering breath, her body going limp in the chair. Then, as Hannah's body still twitched in final reflex, the nervous system firing its last random signals, Samuel turned to Margaret, pulled her to him, and took her with a violence that left marks on her body she would have to carefully hide beneath long sleeves and high collars for weeks. His hands left bruises on her arms, her hips, her thighs. He bit her shoulder hard enough to draw blood. And Margaret welcomed it all, understanding that this pain was part of the experience, that she needed to feel physical hurt to match the psychological transgression she was committing. When it was over, she lay on the floor of Samuel's cabin, her dress torn, her body aching, and Hannah's corpse still visible in the chair just feet away. And she had never felt more satisfied in her entire life. Afterward, Margaret helped dispose of the body. It was her idea. Actually, a way of completing her transformation from witness to participant. They carried Hannah's corpse to a section of the plantation where the soil was soft and deep, and together they buried her where she would never be found. Walking back to the main house as dawn approached, her nightgown filthy with dirt and blood beneath her robe, Margaret understood that she had crossed the final threshold. She was no longer even remotely the person she had been before September. She was a murderer, participant in serial killing, a woman who achieved sexual pleasure through violence and death, and she felt more alive than she had ever imagined possible. Over the following months, the pattern repeated and evolved. Every 6 to 8 weeks, circumstances would align perfectly. Thomas would be away on business or occupied with plantation affairs that kept him late in the fields. Samuel would select another victim, always for reasons that gave Thomas plausible justification if questions were ever raised. A theft that needed punishing, disrespectful behavior that challenged his authority, an attempted escape that required making an example, women whose disappearance could be explained as punishment gone too far, or running away, or any of the dozen other excuses that plantation society accepted without deeper investigation, because they did not want to know the truth. The third victim was a woman named Patience, 24 years old, who had tried to poison one of the overseers after he raped her repeatedly. Samuel brought her to a shed on the far edge of the plantation, and this time Margaret participated more actively. She held Patience down while Samuel cut her, and she discovered that touching the dying woman, feeling the life leave her body, was even more intense than simply watching. The fourth was a teenage girl named Ruth, who had stolen food from the main house kitchen. Samuel strangled her slowly in his cabin, while Margaret and he took turns using her body. The fifth was an older woman named Esther, who had been spreading rumors about Samuel's activities. They drowned her in a water trough, holding her head under while she struggled, and Margaret held her for the final minute, feeling Esther's life extinguish beneath her hands. Each murder became more elaborate, more extreme. They experimented with different methods, different locations, different levels of participation for Margaret. Sometimes Margaret would touch the victims herself while they died, her hands joining Samuel's in the act of killing. Sometimes she and Samuel would have sex while a dying woman watched, forced to witness what her death meant to them. What pleasure was being extracted from her suffering? And each time Margaret's orgasms became more intense, more completely consuming, more necessary to her continued existence. If you have stayed with us through this disturbing journey into the darkest corners of human nature, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into history's hidden horrors. This story challenges everything we think we know about evil. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on what drives people to such darkness. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these buried truths to light. Their relationship developed a terrible intimacy that went beyond the physical acts. They could not be seen together publicly, could never acknowledge their connection in the daylight world, where Margaret was mistress and Samuel was property. But in the darkness they were equals in monstrosity, partners in transgression, united by shared darkness that both defined and sustained them. They developed their own language, their own signals. A certain look across the dinner table when Thomas was talking could mean 3 nights from now. A specific position of Samuel's hand on a tool could indicate which woman he had selected as their next victim. Samuel began teaching Margaret the psychology of killing in their quiet moments together, how to select victims who would not be missed immediately or whose disappearance could be explained in multiple plausible ways, how to read fear in another person's eyes, recognizing the exact moment when hope dies and acceptance begins, how to make death last exactly as long as they wanted it to, neither rushing nor extending beyond the point of maximum effect. Margaret discovered she had a natural talent for this psychological manipulation, an intuitive understanding of human vulnerability, and how to exploit it that surprised even Samuel. "You were always this," Samuel told her one night as they lay together after disposing of their 6th victim. "You just did not know it. The numbness you felt before, that was your real self, trying to emerge, but being suffocated by the role you were forced to play. Now you are finally being who you were always meant to be." Margaret believed him. Had to believe him because the alternative was accepting that she had been corrupted, transformed into something monstrous by external influence. But if this darkness had always existed within her, waiting only for the right circumstances to emerge, then she was not guilty of becoming evil. She was simply discovering her true nature. It was a rationalization that let her sleep at night in the rare hours when she slept at all. By spring of 1853, 6 women had died, their bodies buried in hidden locations across the plantation's 1,000 acres. And Margaret had helped kill the last 3, participating directly rather than merely watching. The plantation continued functioning normally on its surface. Thomas remained focused on tobacco prices and business correspondence. His days consumed with the management details came with owning a large plantation. The slave community lived in terror, understanding that women disappeared, but not knowing why or how to prevent it. Nobody dared speak openly about their suspicions, and Margaret and Samuel continued their dark partnership. Bound together by secrets would destroy them both if revealed, but sustainability was always an illusion. Margaret understood this intellectually, even as she convinced herself that they could continue indefinitely. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Every death increased the risk of discovery. Every body buried was evidence waiting to be found. Every encounter between Margaret and Samuel increased the chance that someone would notice, would talk, would alert Thomas to the relationship that existed beneath his own roof. It was only a matter of time before something broke, before their careful planning failed, before the house of lies they had constructed collapsed under its own weight. The catalyst for destruction came not from outside investigation, but from Margaret's own escalating hunger. By late spring, she found that simple witnessing and participation were no longer enough. The pleasure she derived from watching women die remained intense, but it no longer satisfied her completely. She needed more, needed to feel ultimate power, not just as an observer or participant, but as the primary actor. She wanted to be the one who decided when death came, wanted to be the one whose hands delivered it, and most significantly, she wanted Thomas dead. The idea came to her fully formed one morning at breakfast, while watching her husband eat his eggs and read his newspaper with perfect contentment. She hated him, not for anything he had specifically done to her. Thomas had never been cruel or abusive. He had provided her with wealth, status, security, everything that society said a woman should want. But she hated him for everything he represented, for the years of numbness before Samuel awakened her, for his satisfied ignorance of what happened on his own property, for existing as an obstacle to the life Margaret now wanted, which was living openly with Samuel, continuing their dark practices without the constraints of hiding, without the limitations imposed by Thomas's ownership of the plantation, and everyone on it. She brought the idea to Samuel that evening in his cabin, stating it plainly, without preamble or justification. "I want to kill my husband, and I want you to help me do it." Samuel regarded her in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than shocked or resistant. That is different from field slaves. That is the plantation owner. That brings real investigation. Federal marshals. If necessary, consequences that affect both of us in ways we might not survive. I know, but I can make it look natural. I have been reading about poisons in Thomas's library, about how certain deaths can appear like heart failure or stroke, especially in a man who works as hard as Thomas does. We could do it slowly, symptoms that gradually worsen over months. By the time he actually dies, everyone will assume it was natural causes. No one would suspect. "No," Samuel said flatly, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "That is not how it happens. If you want to kill him, you do it my way. Quick, violent, and with him knowing exactly who is killing him and why. He needs to understand what you have become, what his wife really is. He needs to see you with me, needs to watch us together, needs to die knowing that everything he thought he had was a lie. And you are the one who cuts his throat while I watch. That is the price. That is how this happens. If it happens at all." Margaret felt her body respond immediately to these words, heat flooding through her despite the spring warmth. The image Samuel was painting, Thomas dying by her hand, understanding in his final moments what his wife had become, what she had been doing in the darkness while he slept, was intensely arousing, more arousing than anything they had done so far. "Yes," she whispered, her voice. "That is what I want." "Exactly that? Then we plan it carefully. Make it look like a robbery or attack. Something that does not point to either of us. And we only get one chance. If it fails, if Thomas survives, or if the investigation leads back to us, We both die. You understand that? You will hang and I will burn. That is what happens to murderers who kill plantation owners. They spent weeks planning Thomas's death with the same meticulous attention Samuel brought to selecting and killing his other victims. They studied Thomas's routines, mapping out his daily patterns with precision. They identified opportunities, moments when he would be vulnerable and alone. They prepared explanations for their own whereabouts, alibis that would hold up under questioning. And they chose a date in early July when Thomas would be returning late from a business meeting in Richmond, traveling the last miles to the plantation after dark on a road that was known to be dangerous, but careful planning could not account for Thomas's own intelligence, which Margaret had consistently underestimated. Her husband was not the oblivious fool she had believed him to be. He had been paying attention all along, noting small details that individually meant nothing, but collectively formed a pattern. Margaret's changed demeanor over the past months, the marks on her body that she tried to hide, her frequent absences from the house at odd hours, the way she looked at Samuel when she thought no one was watching, and most damningly, Thomas had noticed that women were disappearing from his plantation at a rate that exceeded normal runaways. 3 days before the planned murder, Thomas confronted Margaret in the privacy of their bedroom. He dismissed the servants early, locked the door, and when he turned to face his wife, his expression was harder than Margaret had ever seen it. "I know about you and Samuel," he said without preamble, his voice cold and controlled. "I have known for months." Margaret's heart stopped. Every possible response fled her mind, leaving only the terrible certainty that everything was about to collapse. But Thomas was not finished. "I have also discovered where the bodies are buried. 7 of them now, women who disappeared from this plantation killed by Samuel. And you, my dear wife, helped with at least 3 of those murders." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stood frozen, watching her husband with the full understanding that he held her life in his hands. If he reported what he knew, she would hang. Nothing could save her from that outcome. But Thomas's next words were not what she expected. "I am not going to report it, either of you, because doing that destroys me too. My reputation, my business, everything I have built." A plantation owner who kept a serial killer as his most valuable slave, who was too blind to notice his wife was participating in murder. I would be ruined even if I was not legally culpable. Margaret found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Then what do you want?" Thomas sat down heavily in the chair by the window, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. "I want honesty, at least between us, now that pretending is pointless. I want to understand how you became this, and I want to know what happens next, because clearly the current situation cannot continue." What followed was the strangest conversation of Margaret's life. Over the course of 2 hours, she explained everything to Thomas, not just the facts of what had happened, but how it had felt, the numbness before, the awakening during, the complete transformation of her existence. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, Thomas spoke carefully. "I should feel horror, disgust, but honestly, what I feel most is failure. I gave you everything that society says a woman needs to be happy. Comfort, security, status, and it meant nothing, less than nothing. You found more fulfillment with a slave and murder than you ever found with me." "Yes," Margaret said simply, because there was no point in softening the truth now. and you were planning to kill me. Don't deny it. I can see it in your face. Yes, Thomas nodded slowly. Here's what happens now. Samuel gets sold tomorrow. I have already arranged it with a trader who leaves for Mississippi at week's end. He will be gone before anyone can object. And you and I continue our marriage, but with full understanding of who you actually are. No more delusions about respectable plantation life. You are a killer married to a man who was complicit in keeping a killer. We are bound together by that truth now. Margaret felt panic rising. No, you can't sell Samuel. I won't let you. You have no choice, because if you try to stop me, I report everything. You hang and Samuel burns. That is the alternative. The next 3 days were agony for Margaret. She could not warn Samuel without revealing that she had told Thomas everything. Couldn't stop the sale without destroying herself. She was trapped in exactly the way she had trapped Thomas's victims, powerless and watching destruction approach. But Samuel was not a passive victim. He had been paying attention, too, had noticed changes in Thomas's behavior. And on the night before he was scheduled to be transported to the trader's compound, Samuel came to the main house. He entered through an unlocked window, moved silently through hallways he knew perfectly, and arrived at Thomas and Margaret's bedroom, where they slept in their separate beds, as they had throughout their marriage. Margaret woke to find Samuel standing over Thomas with a knife and her husband waking to the same terrible sight. What happened next occurred with devastating speed. Samuel dragged Thomas from his bed, the older man struggling, but completely outmatched by Samuel's superior strength. Margaret found herself making a choice she had not consciously formed, but one that came from the deepest part of who she had become. She did not scream, did not call for help, did not try to stop what was about to happen. Instead, she stood and watched as Samuel forced Thomas into a chair and began binding him with rope that he had brought specifically for this purpose. Your wife and I are leaving here tonight, Samuel said calmly as he secured Thomas's wrists behind the chair back. Together as free people. And you are not going to stop us, because you will be dead. But first, you are going to watch something, going to see exactly what your wife prefers over you, going to understand who she really is, what she has become, and what role you played in creating her. And then, while Thomas sat bound and helpless, while his eyes went wide with the full understanding of what was happening, Samuel took Margaret right there in their bedroom. It was brutal and passionate, and everything that Margaret's marriage bed had never been. He threw her onto the bed that she had shared with Thomas for 6 years, that same bed where she had lain countless nights, feeling nothing, while Thomas performed his conjugal duties with mechanical precision. But now that bed became the stage for something Thomas could never have imagined. Samuel did not treat Margaret with the gentle respect that Thomas believed women required. He used her body roughly, possessively, and Margaret responded with equal aggression, her nails raking down his back, her teeth finding his shoulder, her voice crying out with pleasure that echoed off the bedroom walls. Thomas watched it all, understanding in those terrible minutes exactly what his wife had become, understanding that every moment of their marriage had been a lie. That while he had believed himself a good husband, providing well for a contented wife, she had been suffocating under the weight of his respectability, that his kindness and consideration had meant nothing to her, that everything he thought he had built with her was an illusion, and the real Margaret was this creature writhing beneath a slave on their marriage bed, experiencing pleasure with a murderer that she had never felt with him, When Samuel finished, he pulled Margaret to her feet and handed her the knife. The same knife he had used on Clara that first night in the garden. The knife that had ended so many lives. "Your turn," he said simply. "Show him who you really are." Margaret took the knife, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. She had held it before, when disposing of bodies, when cleaning evidence. But she had never used it herself for the actual killing. That had always been Samuel's role. But now, looking at Thomas's face, seeing his expression shift from horror to resignation to something that might have been heartbreak, she felt no hesitation. She approached her husband slowly, letting him see her clearly in the lamplight, letting him take in her disheveled appearance, her flushed skin, the mark Samuel had left on her body. "You asked me once what would make me happy," Margaret said, her voice steady. "You tried so hard to be a good husband. Gave me everything society says a woman should want. But you never understood that I did not want any of it. Didn't want the life you offered. I wanted this. I needed this. And you were just in the way." She placed the knife against Thomas's throat, feeling his pulse jumping frantically beneath the blade. Samuel stood behind her, his hands on her hips, guiding her, supporting her. Slow, he murmured in her ear. "Not quick like with the others. He needs to feel it, needs to understand it." Margaret drew the blade across Thomas's throat, but not deep enough to kill immediately, just deep enough to start the bleeding. Thomas made a choking sound, his eyes going wide. She made a second cut deeper this time, and blood began flowing freely. Thomas's body convulsed against the ropes binding him to the chair. And Margaret, watching her husband die by her own hand, felt Samuel enter her from behind, felt her body respond with that same overwhelming intensity it had shown every other time they had killed together. Thomas drowned in his own blood while his wife climaxed, his last sight being Margaret in the arms of the man who had destroyed everything. His last understanding was that he had never really known his wife at all, that the woman he had married was a fiction, and the real Margaret was a monster who'd been waiting for someone like Samuel to unlock her true nature. It took 4 minutes for Thomas to die completely, his movements gradually slowing, his eyes dimming, until finally he sat still in the chair, his head slumped forward, blood pooling on the floor beneath him. They staged the scene carefully after Margaret's body stopped trembling, after she had washed Thomas's blood from her hands and changed into clean clothing. Samuel had done this before, staged crime scenes to look like something they were not. And he worked with the efficiency of long practice. They made it look like a robbery gone wrong, like thieves had broken into the house seeking valuables and been surprised by Thomas awakening. Windows were broken from the outside. Thomas's strong box was ransacked. Cash and jewelry removed to make it look like theft was the motive. The bedroom was disrupted to suggest a struggle. Samuel knew every detail of plantation layout and security, knew exactly where the night watchman would be at what times, knew which slaves could be trusted to keep silent about things they might have heard, knew how to make this appear like something it was not. And within an hour, the scene looked convincingly like what it was supposed to be rather than what it actually was. In the chaos that followed Thomas's death, in the investigations and the shock that rippled through Virginia society, no one thought to question the grief-stricken widow too carefully. Margaret performed her role flawlessly. She wore black. She wept at appropriate moments. She accepted condolences with the grace expected of a woman of her position. and she told the same story over and over until it became more real than the truth. Thieves had broken in. Her husband had been murdered. She had hidden in her dressing room, frozen with terror, unable to help him. It was a tragedy, a random act of violence that could have happened to anyone. The local sheriff investigated for 3 weeks before concluding that the perpetrators had probably been passing through the area, that they would never be caught, that these things happened sometimes in a world where criminal elements moved freely. Thomas's business associates expressed their shock and sympathy. The church held a memorial service that Margaret attended, dressed head to toe in widow's weeds, playing the role of bereaved wife so convincingly that even she almost believed it. Margaret officially inherited the plantation as Thomas's sole heir. His will, written years earlier, when their marriage was new, and he had no reason to suspect his wife of anything, left everything to her without condition. And within weeks of the will being probated, Margaret had manumitted Samuel through a carefully crafted legal process, freeing him officially while binding him to her property through an employment contract that gave him overseer status and a share of plantation profits. Suspicion swirled. Of course, some people noticed the speed with which a widow moved on, the unusual relationship with her former slave, the way Samuel seemed to hold authority on the plantation that no employee should possess. But Margaret was wealthy now, and wealth bought silence and social tolerance that transgressors could never afford. The plantation produced profitable tobacco crops. Margaret paid her bills promptly. She made generous donations to the local church. And gradually, people chose to look away from things that made them uncomfortable, choosing to believe the official story rather than investigate what might lie beneath it. If you have been gripped by this dark journey into America's hidden horrors, help us continue uncovering these buried truths by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. What other sinister secrets might be waiting in your local history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By autumn of 1853, a year after that night in the garden had changed everything. Margaret and Samuel were living openly together on Whitmore Plantation, though maintaining the pretense that Samuel was merely an employee. The other slaves whispered and feared. Local society talked and judged, but no one had concrete evidence of anything criminal. And Margaret's wealth insulated her from consequences that would have destroyed someone with less money. The bodies buried across the plantation's 1,000 acres remained undiscovered. 7 women whose disappearances had been explained and dismissed, whose families and friends had no recourse for justice. Margaret and Samuel had literally gotten away with murder. Multiple murders. The most disturbing aspect of this conclusion is what happened next. In early December of 1853, new slaves arrived at Whitmore Plantation. Young women purchased at auction, brought to work the fields, and as these women were processed and assigned quarters, Margaret stood on the main house veranda. Watching their arrival, Samuel stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. The official record ends here, but unofficial accounts, whispered story never written down, but passed through enslaved communities and abolitionist networks, suggest that the killing did not stop, that Margaret and Samuel continued their dark partnership, selecting victims from among the women they now owned outright, disposing of bodies in the hidden places they had already prepared. Some historians speculate that as many as 20 additional women may have disappeared from Whitmore Plantation between 1853 and 1861, when the Civil War disrupted plantation operations. But no bodies were ever found. No investigations were ever launched. And Margaret lived out her life as a respected, if eccentric Virginia widow, dying in 1889 at the age of 65. Samuel's fate is less clear. Some accounts claim he died in 1872, still living on the former Whitmore property. Others suggest he left Virginia entirely after the war, disappearing into the chaos of Reconstruction. But regardless of what actually happened to him, his legacy remained in the fear that persisted among formerly enslaved people who had lived on the plantation. Stories they told their children about a place where women vanished and evil wore a human face. This mystery shows us that monsters are not always recognizable as such. Margaret Whitmore appeared in every way to be exactly what Southern society valued: beautiful, refined, educated, wealthy. Samuel was dismissed as merely dangerous property, his intelligence and calculation overlooked, because society refused to see enslaved people as fully human. Together they created a partnership in evil that persisted for years, hidden in plain sight, protected by wealth and social structures that refused to investigate crimes committed against people considered less valuable than those who owned them. The most enduring question is whether Margaret was corrupted by Samuel, or whether something dark had always existed in her, waiting only for the right circumstances to emerge. The evidence suggests the latter. Margaret's profound dissatisfaction with her life, her complete numbness to normal experiences, and her instant, intense response to violence, all point to someone whose psychology was fundamentally different from typical humans. Samuel did not create this in her. He simply provided the catalyst that allowed her to become what she was always meant to be. What do you think of this story? Could someone really transform this completely? Or was Margaret always capable of this darkness? How many other hidden partnerships like this might exist in history, buried under respectability and silence? Leave your comment below sharing your theories. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden horror in American history and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates dark mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters are often those who appear most civilized, and the darkest secrets are those that history chooses not to investigate too carefully. See you in the next